Today, I'm going to speak to you about Saint Prince Vladimir or Volodymyr, the Great, the baptizer of Rus. My talk, as Michael said, is based on research from my first book, The Liturgical Past in Byzantium and Early Rus, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2019. The stories that we're going to be discussing come from a historical document known as the Повесть временных лет, which is translated as the Tale of Bygone Years, or what scholars now typically call the Rus Primary Chronicle or the Primary Chronicle. This chronicle is the earliest surviving East Slavic historical record. It was compiled, we think, in the second decade of the 12th century by monks at the Monastery of the Caves in Kiev. The biography of Prince Vladimir, which is found in the Primary Chronicle, spans a period of nearly 50 years. His reign is remembered reverently as a period of religious transformation. However, this did not prevent the chroniclers from divulging some of the more unsavory details of Vladimir's prodigal youth. A great sinner makes for a great convert, after all, and so the bookmen in Kiev did not shy away from recounting the deeds of Vladimir as a lustful and marauding pagan warrior. For the purposes of this talk, I'm going to assume that not everyone has read the stories about Prince Vladimir in the Rus Primary Chronicle. In fact, I'm going to assume that maybe not everyone has even heard of Prince Vladimir prior to the talk today. As a result, my plan is to start with kind of a lengthy summary of Prince Vladimir's life and deeds as they're preserved in the Rus Primary Chronicle. Then, in the remaining portion of the talk, I'm going to turn to the subject of source studies. That is, the study of where these stories came from and how they came to be written down in the chronicle text. But before we get to all that, let's begin by reviewing the biography of the famed baptizer of Rus. Prince Vladimir was the son of this stoic-looking gentleman that you see here, Prince Sviatoslav, who was a feared warrior prince. But Prince Vladimir himself makes his debut in recorded history in the chronicle in rather hazardous circumstances. While still an adolescent in Kiev, his homeland was invaded by a tribe of Turkic nomads from the Eurasian steppe. And this is what the chronicle tells us. In the year 7476, or the way we count time, 968, the Pechenegs invaded Rus for the first time. While Sviatoslav was at Peryaslavets, so Olga shut herself up in the city of Kiev with her grandsons Yaropolk, Oleg, and Vladimir. And the nomads besieged the city with a great multitude. Now, Vladimir and his brothers were eventually freed in a daring rescue attempt staged by one of their father's generals. Nothing more was heard about the young prince until 970, when Sviatoslav appointed him to rule in Novgorod, which you see an illustration of what medieval Novgorod might have looked like there. Novgorod was the most ancient city in the land of Rus on the banks of Lake Ilmen. 2 years later, Sviatoslav was killed while attempting to navigate the riverways back to Kiev following a successful military campaign against the Byzantines. Here's how the chronicle describes it. Sviatoslav approached the rapids and Kuria, prince of the Pechenegs, attacked him, and they killed Sviatoslav. They took his head and made a cup out of it, overlaying his forehead with gold, and they drank from it. With their father's head serving as a gilded drinking vessel, the supreme rank among Rus princes fell to Yaropolk, the oldest of Sviatoslav's 3 sons. He began to rule in Kiev, but soon a blood feud sprang up amongst the brothers. In 976, following a hunting dispute, Yaropolk and Oleg came to blows, and the younger brother Oleg perished in the skirmish. Fearing for his life, Vladimir fled back to Scandinavia, abroad to Scandinavia, and assembled an army of Varangians, or Vikings. 2 years later, Vladimir sailed back to Rus, retook Novgorod, and prepared to march against his brother in Kiev. And the princes of Rus were always warring with each other, by the way, regardless of the fact that they were all relatives. Now, Yaropolk refused to meet Vladimir in battle, and so a siege ensued. Vladimir eventually convinced one of Yaropolk's most trusted military advisors, a man named Blut, that he should betray his prince. The traitorous general persuaded Yaropolk to meet with his brother and make peace, but the proposed summit turned out to be a trap. And here's again how the chronicle describes it. Yaropolk came to Vladimir, and as he entered the door, two Varangians stabbed him in the breast with their swords. Blud then shut the doors behind Yaropolk so that his men could not follow him, and thus Yaropolk was slain. And here's a depiction of that murder in what's called the Radziwiłł Codex, which is this version of the chronicle from the 1490s, and which is famous for its colorful miniatures, like you see here. And so throughout the talk, you'll see a number of illustrations that look like this. They're all from this very famous Radziwiłł Codex. Okay, so with both of his brothers now dead, Vladimir began to reign alone in Kiev. He took for himself Yaropolk's wife, who was a former nun, and she bore him a son named Sviatopolk. The prince also constructed idols on the hills surrounding Kiev, a practice that the monastic chroniclers strongly condemn. The chroniclers also made a point to condemn Prince Vladimir's prodigal lifestyle, and particularly his sexual appetite. Vladimir was overcome by lust for women, we learn in the chronicle. He had 300 concubines at Vushgorod, 300 at Belgorod, and 200 at Berestova. He was insatiable in fornication, taking for himself married women and violating virgins. For he was a lover of women like unto Solomon, for it is said that Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. The prince's bad behavior continued in the chronicle passage for the year 983, an account known as the Tale of the Varangian Martyrs. This short hagiographical entry recounts the martyrdom of two Vikings, a father and son, instigated by Vladimir and his boyars following a military victory. In the passage, the prince and his people cast lots for a youth and a maiden to sacrifice to the gods, so human sacrifice. The lot falls on the son of a Varangian, a Christian, who steadfastly refused to hand over his son. And here's a 19th century depiction of this story. An angry mob subsequently stormed the Varangians' estate and murdered both father and son. The chronicler bemoaned the violence of these, quote, ignorant pagans, but praised the faith of the persecuted foreigners who have, quote, received the heavenly crown with the holy martyrs and the just. Now, religious themes take center stage again in the year 986, when the prince is suddenly represented as exhibiting a keen interest in the doctrine and religious worship of other lands. Proselytes from the three major monotheistic traditions traveled to Kiev and presented their respective faiths before the court. The first to arrive were Bulgar Muslims. And Vladimir said, "What is your faith?" They answered, "We believe in God, and Muhammad teaches us to practice circumcision, to not eat pork, and to not drink wine. But after death," he said, "they will satisfy their lusts with women." Vladimir listened to them with pleasure, for he was himself a lover of women and great indulgence, but circumcision and abstinence from pork were disagreeable to him. Concerning drinking, he said, "For the Rus, there is joy in drinking. We cannot be without it." The next missionaries were from the Pope of Rome. They began to describe their beliefs and fasting practices, but Vladimir abruptly dismissed them, adding only that his ancestors, quote, accepted no such principles. Jewish preachers from Khazaria were the next to speak, and they also failed to impress the barbarian prince. Finally, a Byzantine philosopher appeared before the Kievan court. He sharply criticized the teachings of other delegates and briefly recounted the events of the Incarnation and crucifixion. At this point in the story, Vladimir interrupts him and says, "Why did God come down to earth and accept such a passion?" The philosopher then answered and said, "If you wish to hear, then I shall tell you from the beginning." Vladimir said, "I will listen gladly." In a section of the chronicle known as the philosopher's speech, it's quite a long section, the Greek representative responded with an extensive exposition of the Old and New Testaments. He recounted to Prince Vladimir the history of the world from its beginning and concluded by showing him a curtain depicting the Last Judgment, with the righteous going to their bliss in paradise on the right side and sinners on their way to torment on the left. Vladimir sighed and said, "Happy are they on the right, but woe to those on the left." The philosopher replied, "If you wish to stand on the right with the righteous, then be baptized." Vladimir took this to heart and said, "I will wait a little longer," for he wished to investigate all the faiths. Vladimir then gave the philosopher many gifts and dismissed him with great honor. The prince launched this religious investigation in the Annals for 987, so the year 987. He first consulted with his boyars, who counseled him to, quote, test the services of each land and how they worship God. Vladimir heeded their advice and sent off 10 good and wise men to inspect the religious rituals of the Muslim Bulgars, the Germans loyal to Rome, and the Greeks in Constantinople. So that is what the Rus called the Byzantines Greeks. Little attention is given in the chronicles of the first two expeditions, but the third is described in sumptuous detail. The emissaries arrived in the imperial city, and the emperor ordered the patriarch to celebrate the divine services in Hagia Sophia, so, quote, that the Rus might behold the glory of our God. Now, here's how the chronicle describes this next part of the service. It said, when the patriarch heard this, he ordered the clergy to assemble, and they celebrated the feast as was their custom. They lit the censers, and the choirs sang hymns. The emperor went with them into the church and placed them in a wide space. He showed them the beauty of the church, the singing and the archiepiscopal services, and the ministry of the deacons, and explained to them the service of his God. The Rus were amazed, and in wonder they praised their service. The emissaries subsequently returned to Rus and reported their findings to Prince Vladimir. They begin by ridiculing the rights of the Bulgars and Germans, but their tone changed drastically when they related their experience in Constantinople. Then we went to the Greeks, they reported to Vladimir, and they led us to the place where they served their God. And we knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth. This is a very famous line from the Chronicle. And we knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth. For on earth there is no such splendor or beauty, and we are unable to describe it. We only know that God dwells there among men, and that their service is better than those of all other lands, for we cannot forget that beauty. The boyars unanimously endorsed the Byzantine faith and reminded the prince that it had also been adopted by his grandmother, Princess Olga, who was known as the wisest of all people. Vladimir asked his boyars where he should be baptized, and they answered that the decision was up to him. At this point, the chronicle text for the year 987 abruptly ends, and the entry for the year 988 begins. So the famous year 988, right? The reader learns that Prince Vladimir is still unbaptized. He's taking his time, and he has resumed campaigning with his army. The target this time was Kherson, a Byzantine outpost on the Black Sea, about 350 miles south of Kiev. The prince and his forces found themselves mired in a protracted military siege, and they were beginning to grow impatient. Here's what happens next. Then a man of Kherson named Anastasius shot an arrow into the Rus camp, on which he had written, "There are wells behind you to the east. Dig down and cut off the one from which water flows in pipes." When Vladimir heard this, he raised his eyes to heaven and said, "If this proves true, I will be baptized." Shortly thereafter, the flow of water into Kherson was stopped, the inhabitants surrendered, and Vladimir and his retinue entered the city. The victorious prince subsequently sent a message to the emperors Basil and Constantine, threatening a similar siege of Constantinople unless their sister were given to him in marriage. And here's a picture from the Radziwiłł Codex showing the emperors trying to convince their sister to marry this barbarian Vladimir. So the emperors answered that they were unable to marry her to a pagan, Princess Anna, that is, but if he were willing to be baptized, he would gain her as a wife, inherit the kingdom of God, and be their companions in the faith. Prince Vladimir agreed to this request, acknowledging that he had tested their religion and found their liturgical services especially pleasing. After continued negotiations, the emperors sent their sister, Princess Anna, and a cohort of priests to Kherson for the baptism of her husband-to-be. The princess was reluctant to leave, suggesting that death would be better than the arranged marriage, but her brothers convinced her that she must do her part to save the empire from a bloody and costly war. Arriving in Kherson, the princess found Vladimir blind from a disease of the eyes, a misfortune the chronicler attributed to divine providence. So she instructed Vladimir to accept baptism immediately, otherwise he would never be cured. When Vladimir heard this, the chronicle tells us, he said, if this proves to be the truth, then the God of the Christians is truly great. Then he ordered that he should be baptized. The bishop of Kherson, together with the princess's priests, after catechizing him, baptized Vladimir. And when the bishop laid his hand upon him, the prince immediately regained his sight. And seeing this sudden cure, Vladimir glorified God, saying, now I have known the true God. And I don't have time to get into this section, unfortunately, in our talk today, but this conversion model is, as I show in my book, is very clearly modeled on the liturgical services for both St. Paul the Apostle, who you remember is blinded on the road to Damascus, and of character we're going to talk a lot about, St. Constantine the Great. All right, so now Vladimir has known the true God. What happens next? Following the supernatural healing at baptism, Vladimir and Anna were married. The prince then conducted his new bride, a company of clerics, and the relics of Saint Clement and Phoebus back to Kiev. Once ensconced in the capital, Vladimir began the work of converting his realm to the new faith. He ordered idols to be overthrown, cut into pieces, and burned. And at his command, a wooden statue of Perun was ceremoniously dumped into the river. Next, the prince summoned the whole city to the banks of the Dnieper, where the priests of the princes and those from Kherson, he presided over the baptism of Rus. And as you see on the slide there, this is an event immortalized on the fresco of in the bell tower of Holy Trinity Monastery, of course, which is where the Russian History Museum is located. All right, so now we've had the mass baptism. Here's how it's described. They went into the water, and some stood up to their necks, but others to their breasts. The younger ones were closer to the bank. Others were holding children in their arms, while the adults waited farther out. The priests stood and performed prayers, and there was joy in heaven and upon earth to behold so many souls saved. At this point, Prince Vladimir looked up to heaven and recited a lengthy prayer of his own, after which he ordered churches to be built in the places where pagan idols once stood. The passage draws to an end with a long and triumphant panegyric, praising the inhabitants of Rus as, quote, a new Christian people, the chosen of God. The religious narrative picks up again 7 years later in the chronicle account for 996. In this passage, Vladimir is described as entering a newly completed church dedicated to the Mother of God, so the Theotokos, or Virgin Mary, and he pronounces another long prayer. The chronicle then elaborates on how the building came to be known as the Church of the Tithes, and you see a reconstruction of what that might have looked like there on the slide. So here's what the chronicle says. After completing the prayer, Vladimir said, I give to this Church of the Holy Mother of God 1/10 of my wealth and that of my cities. And he wrote out a pledge and deposited it in the church, saying, anyone who annuls this pledge shall be cursed. And here's another image, which is included in the exhibition of the Russian History Museum, a postcard of Saint Vladimir. Now, for all of his repentance and charity, however, Vladimir was born into a violent world, and he ultimately died in a violent world. In the chronicle account for the year 1015, the reader learns that the saintly man passed away while preparing for war against his very own son, Yaroslav. The prince was mourned by boyars and beggars alike, and his body was interred at the Church of the Tithes. The chronicle account then concludes with an extensive encomium that proclaims Vladimir to have been a new Constantine of mighty Rome, who was himself baptized and who baptized his people. So that is the story in the chronicle about Prince Vladimir. And what we have to keep in mind, of course, is that none of the manuscripts containing this narrative can be dated to anywhere near the late 10th century or early 11th century. In fact, the versions of events recounted above was probably copied down in the early 12th century by clerics who had never met Vladimir, never laid siege to Kherson, and never heard a philosopher speak to the Kievan court. A span of nearly 130 years separated these events from these chroniclers, from the events they described. And I mean, think about it. That's like the same amount of time between the presidency of Bill Clinton and the US Civil War. So we're talking about a long time. If you want to get even more complicated about it, and sadly I don't have time to go into the details, but the actual manuscripts that survive, the earliest of those is the Laurentian Codex, which dates to 1377. So we're talking about almost 400 years. Like the oldest surviving piece of paper that exists with this story on it was copied down 400 years after these events. So that's almost half a millennium, right? We're talking about a long, long time. In fact, so much time had passed, and now I'm talking about that 130-year period, just between the actual historical baptism of Rus and when we're pretty confident that this narrative was copied down, which is the 1110s, basically. So 130 years. When that time had passed, according to the famed philologist Alexei Shakhmatov, by that time, the circumstances of the conversion were already long forgotten, a situation that compelled the chroniclers to, quote, build an edifice upon the sand, to resort to borrowings and analogies. The eminent 19th century church historian Yevgeny Golubinsky shared similar doubts about the chronicle report, as did the highly respected Byzantist Fyodor Uspensky, who in 1888 observed that the factual events of the conversion, quote, lie beneath a seal of mystery that no historian using current scientific methods is able to penetrate. And so as a result of this, and again, I cannot actually go into the details because it gets super complicated and super esoteric, and trust me, you do not want to hear it. But as a result of this, one of like the main industries that has surrounded the study of the Rus Primary Chronicle and the story of the baptism of Rus for 250 years now, ever since the Age of Enlightenment, one of the main ways that the people that study this story and this document have kept themselves occupied is by trying to figure out, so what earlier kinds of materials is this story actually made out of, and who wrote them, and when, and where. And it just becomes this endless hall of mirrors of one hypothetical speculation after another. So we're not going to get into that, but that has strongly characterized the study of this narrative for a very long time. So, if the real historical Vladimir remains shrouded in mystery, what sort of biblical, historiographical, and hagiographical models did the chroniclers draw on when they created the textual figure of Prince Vladimir? And again, we're talking about the character in this story. We're not talking about the actual real historical Vladimir. So, if you were to ask this question, what models? Amidst a gathering of Slavic medievalists, of all those who had ever studied the conversion myth, a great shout would immediately go up throughout the crowd. A chorus of names, ranging from Moses, Melchizedek, and Saint Eustace to Justinian the Great and Harald Fairhair of Norway. All of this would be heard amongst the murmur. More frequently, the names of King David and King Solomon would be pronounced, and the name of the Apostle Paul more frequently still. Yet one name, one candidate for the main typological model for Prince Vladimir would ultimately resound above all the rest, the name of Saint Constantine the Great. Now, such a response is probably to be expected. It takes no great skill, after all, to identify a typological model that is explicitly announced in the text of the Chronicle. Remember when I said there's that encomium, and it includes the words, "This is the new Constantine of mighty Rome." So as the Chronicle itself makes clear, the notion that Vladimir played the same role in Rus that Constantine played in Rome was already widespread among the local clergy by the middle of the 11th century. But how, exactly, did the clerics in Kiev know anything about the life and deeds of St. Constantine? Where were they getting their story about the Roman emperor? A number of textual sources have been nominated as candidates. The well-known Yale philologist Riccardo Picchio, for instance, suggests that what he calls the Constantinian model was acculturated in early Rus through Eusebius's famous hagiography, Life of Constantine. This claim is a rather precarious one, however, because there is no evidence that such a text existed in Rus, in Greek, or in Slavonic translation for the entirety of the pre-modern period. Other thinkers maintain that the conversion of Vladimir in the Rus Primary Chronicle is fashioned after the conversion of Constantine in the 9th century Chronicle of George Hamartolos. Now, there is an extant Slavonic translation of this text dating to the early Middle Ages, and its influence on the first Kievan chroniclers is well documented. Yet, and again, I can't go into the details, a side-by-side comparison of the two stories reveals only the most superficial of similarities. So I do not think they got the story from there. Opinions about the conversion are many and diverse, but there is at least one characteristic that unites a good deal of the research. In study after study, when scholars attempt to explain the origins of the national conversion myth, they do so by making recourse to non-extant hypothetical texts. So texts that we don't actually have any evidence that they actually ever existed, except for linguistic and philological kind of conjectures. So the most famous of all the people to ever study the Chronicles, a man named Alexei Shakhmatov, who you see there in the top left corner, he and his followers have claimed that the story about Vladimir is comprised of several earlier tales which were stitched together, and he identifies something that he calls the Kherson legend, which is the story about Vladimir sieging Kherson and getting the princess Anna, kind of extorting Princess Anna to marry him. And that was combined with what he calls the drevnейший свод, the most ancient chronicle layer, which he thought was composed by clerics at the Church of the Tithes around 1038, 1039. So it's a pretty elaborate theory. Another celebrated doyen of medieval Slavic studies, a man named Dmitry Likhachov, who was actually a Gulag survivor, he conjectured that the Vladimir narrative derives from a hypothetical tale, which he called the tale of the first spread of Christianity in Rus. And Likhachov thought that this non-extant text was the foundational document of all later history writing in early Rus. Still other scholars, such as Nikolai Serebransky, claim that the stories about Vladimir derive from an ancient and long-vanished saint's life, composed while the prince was still alive. Finally, contemporary scholars such as Igor Danilevsky, among many others, cite chapter and verse from the modern Bible when describing the Vladimir stories. But this is despite the fact that no such book, the Bible, the way we think about the Bible is one book, in between two covers, no such book existed like that in Russia until the year 1499. So, time and again, scholars search for the original sources of the Rus conversion narrative. They find nothing, and then they imagine the existence of hypothetical documents in order to fill in the blanks. But what if there was another possibility, grounded in the analysis of real texts that really survive? What if instead of reconstructing the narratives of imaginary manuscripts, we were to turn attention to the narratives that actually do exist and that are preserved inside of a set of books that represent over 75% of the early medieval period's surviving records? Let me repeat that again. Over 75% of all of the literary documents that survive from this period are church books, service books, liturgical manuscripts. So what, in other words, if we stopped looking for Vladimir's archetypes in hypothetical manuscripts and started looking for them in the liturgical books of the Byzantine Church? My suggestion is that the church services were the source of at least some of the information that scholars traditionally attribute to non-extant tales and hagiographies. And now, if you think about it for a second, this should really not surprise us. After all, who was doing the writing of history in the early Middle Ages? Monks, priests. It was predominantly an ecclesiastical practice. Throughout the medieval Christian world, from Northumbria to Novgorod, so all of Europe, it was clerics who wrote and rewrote, copied and recopied the sacred and political histories of their respective communities. But as we know, this was not their primary occupation. The writers of history were first and foremost bishops, priests, monks, ordained members of a sacerdotal caste dedicated to the celebration of the liturgical services. From dawn to dusk, these clergymen lived in a liturgical world surrounded by liturgical books. The sacred texts were constantly in their hands and before their eyes, as they chanted morning prayers and sang matins, as they prepared and consecrated the bread and wine for Holy Communion, as they chanted psalms during the hours and performed vespers at sunset and recited final prayers before sleep. Church books were performed texts, and it was the era's history writers doing the performing. Clerics spent hours and hours reading, praying, singing, chanting, and hearing the divine services every day of their lives. In so doing, they came to deeply internalize the contents of these books. They could recite them from memory with only the slightest mnemonic cue. And this ultimately is why liturgy is so important to the study of early medieval historiography. Because inside those church books, there were sacred stories about the sacred past. Several times a day, clerical history writers went to church, opened the service books, and served the rites. With every prayer and every hymn, they ritually retold the sacred histories of other more ancient communities. They chanted scriptures about the Passover. They commemorated the deeds of the apostles. They sang hymns for Roman emperors. When the services ended and the clerics returned to their cells or walked to the scriptorium, these sacred stories stayed with them. In my view, it was these liturgical rites, and not the writings of Eusebius or Hamartolas, which were primarily responsible for the spread of the so-called Constantinian model. The main way that clerics in Kiev learned about the Holy Emperor, I believe, was by singing hymns about him in church, not by reading from a book in their cells or in the scriptorium. Year after year, the clergy in Kiev went to church and prayed an elaborate myth about Saint Constantine and his Christianization of the Roman Empire. Excuse me. The following hymn from the emperor's feast day on May 21st expresses the basic plot of this myth. This is the Stichira in tone 4. The all-radiant light and never-waning star, passing from unbelief to divine understanding, was led to sanctify his people and city. And beholding the image of the cross in the sky, he heard therefrom, "By this conquer your enemies." And so, having received spiritual understanding as a priest and king, you have mercifully established the Church of Christ, O Father of all right-believing kings, whose relics pour forth healing. O Constantine, equal of the apostles, with your divinely wise mother, pray for our souls. Now, this hymn depicts Constantine, the emperor, in 4 different roles. He is a convert who miraculously hears a voice from the sky and passes from, quote, unbelief to divine understanding. He is a Roman Basilius who conquers his enemies with the image of the cross. He is a priest and king who establishes the Church of Christ. And he is a holy equal of the apostles who intercedes on behalf of the faithful. So what I'm getting at here is that the liturgical services tell a very concrete and very detailed and very elaborate story about Constantine. Singing, hearing, and praying this story over the years, the monks and priests of Rus came to possess a clear picture of what the ideal life and afterlife of a saintly king or saintly monarch should look like. They came to understand precisely what needed to be done, in other words, to make the conversion of their native land look more like the conversion of the Roman Empire. Standing and praying at liturgy, the chroniclers learned that presenting Vladimir as a royal saint entailed considerably more than the mechanical combination of Greek tales and local legends, which is the way Shakhmatov saw it. He thought that, basically that you had the Kherson legend, and you had this older, that you had basically had the story about the philosopher's speech, and then you had the story of the siege of Kherson, and then at some point, clerics had kind of like chopped those things in half and stitched them together to make one story. I don't think that that's necessarily what happened. I think that the clerics realized that they needed to appropriate and adapt Byzantine's own ritual narratives. Let me take it back. I don't know that they were consciously making this decision. I think they were so immersed in this liturgical myth world that it was natural for them to do this. So, as a result, at whatever time the chronicle came to assume its present form, whether that's the year 1115 or a different date, the editors redacted the extant tales into a new narrative showing Vladimir establishing Christianity in Kiev, very much as the Byzantine Rite shows the Emperor Constantine establishing it in Rome. The chroniclers announced the appearance of this new Constantine of Rus not once, but twice in the chronicle text, at the very beginning of the conversion narrative and at the end. The first time is in the tale of the Varangian martyrs in 983, and the declaration is deeply contextual. Whereas the second time in the encomium for the prince in 1015, the comparison is explicit and unmistakable. Okay, so forgive me, but now things are going to get a little more complex and detailed, and I hope this is comprehensible via a Zoom presentation like this. I really have done my best to take out most of like the really nitpicky philological details, but I think some of it just needs to be done just so you think I'm not making all of this up. All right. So I'm going to try to show you now just a very few of the concrete ways that liturgy shaped the writing of the conversion narrative in the Primary Chronicle. On the face of it, the chronicle passage for the year 983 seems to be a conventional saint's life about two Viking martyrs, a father and a son, two Varangians, who are killed for refusing to offer to sacrifice to idols after Vladimir's military victory. Now, from the perspective of a modern reader, there is nothing even remotely saintly about the prince's presentation in the passage. If anything, Vladimir is depicted as a religious villain, as a proud and godless persecutor of the right-believing Varangian Christians. He is the one, after all, who orders the ritual sacrifice and oversees the unruly mob. Yet for those familiar with the mythology of the Byzantine Church, for those who can discern the liturgical elements in the text, the passage suggests a rather different reading. In the final few lines of the entry, the chroniclers provide a series of typological clues written in the language of liturgy, which were particularly meaningful for their clerical readership. So they kind of used liturgy to talk to each other in a kind of code, is one of the things I argue in the book. The Byzantine Rite tells a very specific story about the spread of Christianity in the apostolic and post-apostolic church. The central figure in this story are the apostles, the disciples chosen by Christ to preach the gospel and baptize the nations. The following Kontakion, this is a type of hymn, from the late 11th century feast of Saint Luke the Evangelist is typical of the hymnography for this lofty rank of saints. You were a disciple of the divine word, O holy apostle Luke. Together with Paul, you enlightened the whole world and drove away the darkness, having written the gospel of Christ. In the medieval Eastern Church, a synaxis commemorating all 12 of the apostles was celebrated annually on June 30th. Additionally, each disciple was honored with a special feast day of his own. The original 12 disciples were not the only apostles recognized by the church, however. Many of the 70, the men baptized by tongues of fire on the day of Pentecost, were also commemorated with this distinction. These services for these saints stress their role in turning the world away from idolatry, vanquishing evil spirits, and liberating mankind from the bondage of the devil. For example, At the feast of Saint Quadratus of Athens, the choir chanted this troparion about the early Christian apologist and apostle. And that hymn went like this: "The universe acknowledges you, O preacher of the church, of the Son, and great victor of chastity, Quadratus, for you have enlightened it with your words, and by your martyrdom, O Holy Father, you have trampled upon the enemy. Pray to Christ God to grant us great mercy." As these few verses indicate, Byzantine hymnists had a clear and consistent understanding of what the apostolic mission entailed. Christ had ascended into heaven, but his salvific power and grace continued to be spread through the world through the words and deeds of his specially chosen successors. For the Byzantines, however, election into the apostolic ranks did not end on the day of Pentecost. There was another man, a 13th apostle, carefully chosen by Christ to grow the church and baptize the nations. This man was Constantine the Great, who had received a special charisma from the Lord. Here's how that charisma is described in one of the hymns. "You gave to your pious favorite, O lover of mankind, the wisdom of Solomon, the meekness of David, and the orthodoxy of the apostles. For you are the King of kings and Lord of lords. With him we glorify your loving dispensation, O merciful Jesus, the Savior of our souls." Now, unlike the earliest apostles, who nearly all die as martyrs, Constantine is not a victim in this world, but a victor. He does not sacrifice himself for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Rather, he receives an earthly empire directly from, quote, the emperor of all, Jesus Christ. Here's another hymn. "You were the first to submit the royal purple willingly to Christ, O ever memorable emperor. You thereby came to know God, the emperor of all, benefactor of every beginning and greatest power. Wherefore you were granted an empire, O Christ lover, by merciful Jesus, the Savior of our souls." Constantine may wear the imperial diadem, but that does not prevent him from imitating the deeds of the 12 and the 70. In the hymnography, he is specially called to apostolic service from above and given a very powerful gift, a one-of-a-kind weapon, with which he may conquer all visible and invisible enemies. That weapon is the cross. Here's another hymn. "You gave a mighty weapon to our emperor, Constantine, your precious cross, by which he reigned on earth righteously, shone forth in faith, and has been vouchsafed the kingdom of heaven by your loving kindness. Wherefore we glorify your loving dispensation, O merciful Jesus, the Savior of our souls." In this instance, the hymnography connects the emperor's famous vision of a cross shining in the sky with the legend of his mother's discovery of the true cross in Jerusalem in the year 327. This motif appears throughout the church services, but perhaps most prominently in the canon of the feast. And I'm not going to read all of that, but you can tell, so what's the segment says? "You revealed the weapon of salvation, the indestructible trophy, the hope of Christians, the most honorable cross, which through envy had been hidden." So this service also tells the story of how Helena finds the true cross and that it's this invincible weapon. So as these few examples illustrate, the hymns in honor of the cross promote much of the same political theology as those for Saints Constantine and Saint Helena. In both cases, God and the devil are at war in the post-apostolic era, and the Lord's special warrior in the contest, his chosen successor to the original apostles, is none other than the Emperor of Rome. How convenient. Thus, in the mythology of the Byzantine Rite, St. Constantine wields, quote, the true cross and, quote, the orthodoxy of the apostles in order to liberate the universe from the power of Satan while also defeating enemies of a more visible, this worldly nature. And again, this is just the version of Constantine in the church services. We know from actual history that he just he decriminalized Christianity. He wasn't necessarily the one going around baptizing everybody, right? All right, so a few more details now. The chronicle account for the year 983, the tale of the Varangian martyrs, is fascinating because the devil himself, so the devil who's represented in the text, he recognizes and proclaims these very ideas about the apostles and their imperial imitator Constantine. In the chronicle text, the evil one rejoices at the death of the Varangians and believes he has a permanent habitation in Rus precisely because the apostles never preached there. The devil acknowledges that the teachings of the apostles enlightens the world and frees it from his captivity. But what the devil does not realize, and what the pious declamations in the final lines of the passage make plain, is that the apostles' special successor, Constantine, is also endowed with these powers, and this is important, and that his apostolic deeds can be duplicated in foreign lands. So in other words, there can be more than just one Constantine in other places. The Roman emperor shares in the grace and authority of the apostles, and so too shall Prince Vladimir. Soon in the year 988, he will be called by God to drive the devil out of the land of Rus as bishop and king. Though, quote, at this time the Rus were ignorant pagans, the chronicle reads, the evil one's ruin was approaching. The devil's demise is imminent, moreover, because he will soon be driven out by the true cross. And forgive me for how long this passage is, but we need to take a look at it if I'm going to convince you that there's actually liturgy influencing and shaping this passage. So here's what the chronicle says. It says, the devil yearned to destroy the Christian people, but he was driven out by the true cross, even from these lands. Here the accursed one reasoned, I shall have for myself a home, since the apostles have not taught here, nor the prophets prophesy. He did not know that the prophet had said, I will call those my people who are not my people, and that it is said of the apostles, their message has gone out into all the earth, and their words to the end of the universe. For even if the apostles themselves were never here in the body, their teaching nevertheless resounds like trumpets in churches throughout the world. By their instruction, we triumph over the adversarial enemy, trampling him under our feet, as these two holy fathers also did, having received the heavenly crown with the holy martyrs and the righteous. Okay, so parsing this a little bit here. The chroniclers introduce their counter-argument to the devil's statement with a telling phrase, he did not know. By using this juxtaposition, they set up an interesting situation. The devil knows, presumably from first-hand experience, that the apostles have the power to expel him. But he knows not that the true cross and the instruction of the apostles also possess this power. As should hopefully now kind of be apparent, these phrases introduce a very important liturgical subtext to the passage. Since the true cross is a weapon given by God exclusively to St. Constantine, a chosen ruler called to apostolic kingship. The second citation also reveals the liturgical sources of the chronicler's argument. The text reads, it is said of the apostles, their message has gone out into all the earth and their words to the end of the universe. This verse is from the 19th Psalm, where it has, of course, absolutely no relation to the apostles. The chroniclers, again, clerics who were immersed in the daily practice of the Byzantine rite, they link the psalm to the apostles because it is the main prokimenon verse sung at every feast for each of the 12 apostles in the liturgical year. So it makes perfect sense to them that these words apply to the apostles. Interestingly, in contemporary church books, the same verse is also chanted at the feast commemorating all equal of the apostles, including Constantine, Elena, Vladimir, and Olga. This connection between the salvation of Rus and the preaching of the apostles and equal of the apostles is foregrounded again in the next sentence, where it says, for even if the apostles themselves were never here in the body, their teaching nevertheless resounds like trumpets in churches throughout the world. By their instruction, we triumph over the adversarial enemy. The divine services describe the apostles as, quote, trumpets of theology and, quote, divine trumpets of the word. The chronicle takes the analogy a step further. Though the time of the apostles has passed, their teaching continues to, quote, resound like trumpets in liturgical services performed in churches throughout the world. And it is these services that enable the faithful to overcome the hostile adversary like the apostles of old. So the underlying implication here is that someone will bring these services to Rus. Someone will build the churches in which they are celebrated. Someone will expel the devil with the true cross. So for those acquainted with the Byzantine liturgical past, the chronicle is making a very specific promise that a new Constantine will soon appear in the land of Rus and convert the realm to the Byzantine faith. And of course, this is precisely what Vladimir does in the chronicle entries for the years 988 and 996. Excuse me one second. In fact, from the moment that Prince Vladimir emerges from the baptismal font, he begins to imitate the deeds of the Emperor Apostle Constantine. While still in Kherson, the prince founds a church and selects clerical instruments and icons before setting off for Kiev with, quote, the princess and Anastasius and the priests of Kherson, together with the relics of St. Clement and of Phoebus, his disciple. For those familiar, this is one of the most controversial things I say in the book, so I really enjoy presenting this argument. For those familiar with the liturgical procedures of the Byzantine Church, the description of Vladimir's departure is extremely revealing. The prince leaves Kherson with all of the elements necessary for the founding of an Eastern Christian church, namely the relics of martyrs, clerical vessels, icons, and priests. But there is one striking exception. There is no mention of a bishop, and in the Byzantine tradition, only a bishop can consecrate a new church. This omission in the chronicle is possibly connected to Constantine's own unique status within the church hierarchy. In the 4th century life of Constantine, Eusebius recounted the emperor's own attempt at defining his position. He supposedly said, the life reads, once when he was entertaining bishops at a banquet, Constantine said, while you are bishops of the things inside the church, I too am bishop appointed by God of the things outside it. The hymns and prayers of the divine services represent these imperial liturgical privileges rather liberally, and at times they portray the emperor as a bishop invested with sacramental power. In one of the medieval hymns cited earlier, for instance, Constantine is explicitly called, quote, a priest and king who has mercifully established the Church of God. Later versions of the same hymn from the early modern period state that he established the church and oil with not only with mercy, but, quote, with oil. In another liturgical hymn, and the reason it's with oil is because when a bishop consecrates an altar, he does it with holy chrism. In another liturgical hymn, meanwhile, the emperor is compared to King David and said to have been anointed with, quote, the oil of the Spirit for both political and ecclesiastical service. So here's one of those hymns. It reads, in your deeds you were a new David, receiving from above the horn of anointment upon your royal head. The word transcended in essence, and the Lord anointed you with the Spirit. O most glorious one. Therefore you receive the royal scepter and the heavenly kingdom, and you grant us great mercy. Okay, so keeping this crucial liturgical context in mind, I want to propose a new reading of the story of the baptism of Rus. I suggest that the princely retinue departs from Kherson unaccompanied by a Greek episkopos, so a Greek bishop, for a specific and very significant reason, namely because the chroniclers wish to depict Prince Vladimir as the first bishop of Kiev, as the man chosen by God to baptize its people and consecrate its churches. Now, let me say this very clearly. I am not treating here the historiographical representation of Prince Vladimir. I am talking about the historiographical representation of Prince Vladimir and not the real historical figure. I am not trying to suggest in any way that Vladimir was actually the first bishop of Rus. I'm only suggesting that later chroniclers created a story in which he is portrayed in that fashion. And what's interesting is if you look at the fresco that's at Holy Trinity, they've kind of they've clarified this mistake in the chronicle, right? Like there's clearly a bishop there, but that bishop does not appear in the story that we were talking about today. Anyways, the evidence for my hypothesis is largely found in two chronicle entries describing two seminal events in the early Christian history of Rus. The first is the mass baptism of the residents of Kiev in the year 988, and the second is the consecration of the Church of the Tithes in the year 996. In both passages, the prince presides over the liturgical rites and prays the prayers that an officiating bishop would have prayed at the sacraments of baptism and the consecration of the church. At the mass baptism, Vladimir accompanies the priests into the waters of the Dnieper River, and when, quote, the people were baptized, he rejoiced that he and his new people now knew God. The prince then looked up to heaven and prayed, O Christ God, who has created heaven and earth, look upon these new people and grant that they may know you, the true God, as other Christian nations have known you. Confirm them in the true and inalterable faith, and help me, O Lord, against the hostile enemies, so that hoping in you and your might, I may overcome his intrigues. So this prayer combines several distinct elements of the bishop's prayers from the Byzantine initiation rites. And in the book, I go into fantastic detail where I clearly show where all of these different parts come from. I obviously don't have time to do that right now. If you're super interested in this, I read my book. Why not? Anyways, sadly, I can't prove to you right now that this is in fact all from the Byzantine baptism rites. But anyways, we keep going. Following the mass baptism, Prince Vladimir continues to perform the duties of a bishop and a new Constantine. He orders churches to be built where idols previously stood, and he assigns priests to the cities, inviting people to accept baptism in all the cities and towns. These activities also reflect Constantine's deeds in the services. Like for here, he's talks about how he spurned idols and established churches. I'm not going to read it because this is going on a little bit too long. Don't worry, I'm almost done. If you're asleep, I kindly encourage you to wake back up. This is going to be over shortly. So the chronicler shows Vladimir imitating the Roman emperor's church-building efforts in the year 989, when the prince orders the construction of a church dedicated to the Holy Mother of God, which we talked about earlier, the Church of the Tithes. Now, when Vladimir learns that the church has been completed, he enters it and prays a second great episcopal prayer. He says, "O Lord God, look down from heaven and behold and visit your vineyard and perfect that which your right hand hath planted. Make these new people whose heart you have turned to knowledge to know you as the true God, and look upon this church which I, your unworthy servant, have built in the name of the mother who bore you, the ever-virgin Mother of God, that whoever may pray in this church, you would hear their prayers for the sake of the prayers of the Immaculate Mother of God." The opening verse of this prayer unequivocally confirms Prince Vladimir's depiction in the Chronicle as the first bishop of Rus. At the celebration of a hierarchical divine liturgy in early Rus, during the thrice holy hymn, or the Tri Svetoye, a bishop came out from the altar, stood up on the ambo, and blessed the congregation with two special candles, Dekyrion and Chekyrion. As he performed the blessing, the bishop looked to heaven, raised his hands, and prayed Psalm 80, verses 14 and 15, the verse with which Prince Vladimir began the prayer above. "O Lord, look down from heaven, and behold, and visit your vineyard, and perfect that which your right hand hath planted." Perhaps no other liturgical prayer was so connected to the figure of the bishop as this prayer. It was one of the few prayers publicly recited in front of the entire congregation at a hierarchical divine liturgy that was never recited at non-hierarchical services. So the chroniclers are going to great lengths to portray Vladimir explicitly as the officiating bishop who consecrated the Church of the Tithes, to make him on par, again, with the model of St. Constantine that's in the church services. All right, so what does this all mean? Here's my conclusion. You've made it to the end. Congratulations to all of us. In my first book, I attempt to show that the liturgical rites of the Orthodox Church were in fact powerful ideological tools, forms of mass propaganda, which gave rulers control over their subjects by giving them control over the sacred past. Now, this doesn't mean that the services are also not, prayer and communion and the presence of God. It can be all that too, but there are other elements of it, in my opinion, that are definitely political propaganda. Scholars are by now aware that the past and narrative history of any sort is a construction. It's something we carry around in our heads. They are perhaps less aware that in early Rus, it was largely liturgy doing the constructing. In fact, I am persuaded that it was liturgy more than any other medium or any other technology which created a perception of the sacred past and which instilled that perception in the minds of the people. Standing at worship, the people of Rus learned about the fall and the Exodus, the incarnation and the cross, the witness of the martyrs and the conversion of kings. The universal history of the world from Adam and Christ to Constantine the Great was transmitted across Rus on the notes of liturgical song. As the clergy sang and prayed these songs day after day, the imported past slowly became a native past. The sacred history of the Christian Roman Empire gradually became the sacred history of the Rus. Year after year, the clerics in Kiev went to church and sang the Roman imperial conversion myths. At some point in the mid-11th to early 12th century, these churchmen returned from the services, readied their pens, and wrote down a similar myth for their own community. Their tale focused on four main figures, all members of the ruling dynasty and all later recognized as saints by the Russian Orthodox Church. The story began with the baptism of Princess Olga in Constantinople in the mid-10th century. I didn't have time to talk about that today. It continued with the conversion of her grandson, Prince Vladimir, some 35 years later. So that was what I did talk a little bit about. And it concluded with the martyrdom of two of Vladimir's sons, the princes Boris and Gleb, in the year of their father's passing, which was 1015. So together, these passages formed a myth of Christian origins for the land of Rus that faithfully reproduced the myth of Christian origins for the Roman Empire. The first chroniclers invented a tale of national conversion, and as I've tried to show you very schematically and briefly in my talk today, they based some of that tale on the myths they knew from the liturgical services of the Byzantine Empire. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak today. If you have any questions or comments, I would look forward to hearing them. So thanks.
All right. Now, Agnes would like to know, is Saint Vladimir considered a saint in more than one denomination since he predates the Great Schism? Additionally, when was he canonized and who did this canonization?
Oh, well, I really like the second part of that question. The first part, again, I'm going to have to plead ignorance. As far as I know, I have never ran across anything in other religious denominations where they celebrate Vladimir as a saint. That may not mean that they don't recognize him, but and I would love to be corrected on this. I, in my time, have not run across anything like that. That doesn't mean it hasn't been. The canonization question is super interesting. And like so many things with early Rus, it's shrouded in mystery. Like that's the thing, and I don't know if I did a good job of getting this across in the talk, but when we're talking about 10th, 11th, 12th century Rus, especially the 10th and 11th, early 11th centuries, like we are looking through a glass darkly. There is, well, I mean, there's virtually nothing that actually exists from the period that dates to that period, except for things like the magnificent Cathedral of Saint Sophia that's in Kiev, right? So we have some artifacts of material culture. We have a few gospel books that are very beautiful, but for the most part, very little and sadly very little remains. Now, with the question of canonization, this has been a very controversial topic for a very long time. Because the Eastern Church does not have, especially the Eastern Church in the early middle period, does not have the kind of formalized procedures or criteria for canonization that a lot of people think of, for instance, when they think of like how saints are canonized in the Catholic West, okay? So actually, and this is why I'm so happy that this question was asked, because in the book, I put forward a new theory of canonization. Because the way canonization has traditionally been kind of thought about in early Rus was, well, really, scholars just kind of took the narratives that were told in the saints' lives at face value. Like, oh, Boris and Gleb were murdered by their brother. They didn't resist. There were then these miracles. Everybody realized the miracles. The bishop and his team then they retrieve the relics. They discover they're incorrupt. And then they decide, oh my gosh, everyone realizes they're saints. They write a service and they glorify them at the service, and that kind of is the procedure by which they are entered into the communion of the saints. Well, what I try to show in the last chapter, the conclusion of my book, is that, so if you think about the way it's traditionally been presented, liturgy comes in at the very end of the canonization process. Like you have this whole kind of, process that's played out. And then the final step is they get a liturgical service of their own. And that really, having your own liturgical service, having your own feast day, that's the ultimate marker that you're a saint, right? And typically how we know that, saints became saints in these very early periods. What I think I show in the book is that, well, it's a lot more interesting and complicated than that probably, because if what I show in the book is that the story about Vladimir and Olga and Boris and Gleb is largely modeled and comprised of liturgical materials and liturgical narratives, right? That basically get Russified from Byzantine liturgical models. Well, but what's so interesting about what happens next? So we go from liturgy into history, but then what I show in the last chapter is we go from history back into the liturgy, because the narratives about Vladimir and Olga and Boris and Gleb that are in the chronicle are then the narratives that get chanted at their that get included in the liturgical texts for their feast days, right? And so you have what I call this liturgical loop: liturgy, history, liturgy. And I think it was this liturgical loop that was responsible for the making of saints in early Rus. So what do I mean by that? And I know I'm going on here for a second. I'll try to wrap this up as soon as I can. Basically, what it means is that the chroniclers who created these stories, they built them based on liturgical paradigms. Generations pass, time passes, these people died. Generations come, they all go to the same liturgical services. They all internalize the same liturgical paradigms. And so what happens 100 years later or 200 years later or how many years later, they look back on these stories that are now written in the chronicle and they say, oh my gosh, they're just like the saints. Why? Because it was modeled on the narratives about the saints and liturgical services to begin with. So that is kind of my like narrative ritual theory of how canonization worked in the early Middle Ages. It's kind of like I'm swinging for the fences with that one, but I think that the evidence is there.
All right, thank you. Now, actually, this dovetails nicely with another question from Richard Cooper, who says, superb presentation. Hagiography is an integral part of liturgy. What about particular saints' lives, other than Constantine, that might have also influenced the Vladimir narrative?
Yeah. So this, I've always kind of felt like this was the weakest part of my book. Like, and the reason I didn't treat hagiography was just because like that was a different study. And it's also like hagiography has always been like the universally acknowledged source of all of this, right? So, like as I said earlier, like when people, like Sereb Bronsky in the 19th century thought that, the story about Vladimir was based on a hagiography that had been written in his lifetime. Well, what's interesting about that theory is that if you actually go back and look at and this, I had to do this obviously before writing the book. If you go back and look at those hagiographies, you don't find the exact word for word borrowings from the hagiographies that you find from the liturgical texts. And I think the point that he brings up is that also I think it's wrong to think about hagiography as like this distinct literary genre, because especially in a monastic setting, a lot of these things would be like read and chanted at different points during the day, particularly like, when the monks all share a meal together. So it's a great point. Definitely some of these models do come from the hagiography. It's not what I dealt with specifically in the book. And I would say, in my experience, the liturgical models appear, at least for in the case of these four saints, the liturgical models seem to heavily outweigh the hagiographical models. So hopefully that helps.
All right, that's perfect. Now, time for our final question from Douglas, who asks, what conclusion, if any, can we draw about later Russian history and development from this research? And Sean, if you'd like to discuss just briefly what you've been working on fairly recently with your upcoming publication, now would be a really good time to do so and provide just a glimpse into what's to come.
Okay, sure, yeah. So to kind of give you the elevator pitch, I think that this kind of research into liturgical paradigms and the sacralization of political power has had a massive role in the history of East Slavic and Russian civilization, as we see here at the very, very beginning of things, all the way up into the present day. And especially remarkably with the case of Prince Vladimir himself. So if you look at the picture I don't know if the slides are still up, but if you look at this picture, this is a picture of a monument to Saint Vladimir the Great that was erected just outside the walls of the Kremlin in 2016. And what I've done in some of my recent publications is delve into the memory wars surrounding Saint Prince Vladimir the Great that have taken place in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. And I don't think anybody's going to be shocked by this. Surprise, surprise, it all ends up being about Ukraine. And of course, the Ukrainians, they believe that the myth of sacred origins surrounding Volodymyr, as they call him, belongs to them. And the Russians, of course, say, no, 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 Vladimir belongs to us. And in many ways, really, Vladimir, from about after Maidan, Vladimir slowly became kind of the face of kind of Ruski Mir, or Russian world ideology in many respects. And I've written about this. If you're interested in this, you can Google it, and I have 2 articles on this subject. But the idea of the sacralization of political power, what I'd like to end on is, like, I think that this is something that is particularly unique, perhaps, to Russia, in the post-Enlightenment era. This is a working theory that I have, right? Because, like, what happens in the Enlightenment, supposedly in Western Europe, you have this rupture between political power and the sacred. And in Imperial Russia, and I would argue even in the Soviet Union, and definitely what we're seeing now in post-Soviet Russia in the last 2 terms under Putin especially, that distinction just doesn't hold. And whether we're talking about Tsar Nicholas II or Lenin or Stalin or even perhaps Vladimir Putin, political power is kind of united with this idea that it's handed down from God, just like in the hymns of Saint Constantine the Great, and just like in the stories about Vladimir that we read today. So this is old stuff, but it remains incredibly relevant, it seems.